The first thing Eliza Wren saw through the rain was not the stranger's face. It was the child behind him, small and shivering on the wagon seat, holding a dented tin cup against her chest like it was the last piece of home left in the world. The storm had come early that year. It was only the end of September, 1888, but the Nebraska sky had turned hard and gray before sundown, and a freezing rain swept across the prairie with the sharp bite of January. The wind bent the dry grass flat. It rattled the loose boards of the barn. It pushed at the farmhouse windows like a hand wanting in. Eliza stood beneath the porch roof with a lantern in her fist and a shotgun nowhere in sight, though she wished she had taken it down from above the pantry door. She had run Sparrow Bend Farm alone for 9 years, and 9 years on the frontier taught a woman that pity could be dangerous if it opened the gate too quickly. The man outside the yard stood in mud past his ankles. His hat hung low, dripping water down the sides of his face. One hand held the lead rope of a tired bay mare. The other kept the broken wagon from leaning too far into the ditch. He did not step closer. That mattered to Eliza, though she did not yet know why. "Please, ma'am," he called over the wind. "Let my daughter stay the night. She can sleep inside. I'll take the barn, the shed, the ground if I must, just not her, not in this cold." The little girl on the wagon seat did not cry. That made Eliza look twice. Children who still had strength cried. Children who had run out of strength sat very still and held on to small things. The child's hair was dark and wet against her cheeks. A blanket had been wrapped around her shoulders, but the rain had soaked through it. Her fingers clutched that old tin cup so tightly her knuckles looked pale in the lantern glow. Eliza lifted the lantern higher. "What's your name?" she asked. The man swallowed before answering. "Silas Boone." "Where from?" "South of Red Willow. Been taking repair work where I can find it." "What kind of repair?" "Windmills, pumps, wagon wheels when the road leaves me no choice." Eliza's eyes moved to the wagon. One back wheel had sunk deep. The axle hung crooked. The mare held her front leg carefully as if every inch of mud sent pain through it. "And the child?" "My daughter Annie." At the sound of her name, the girl looked toward the porch. Her eyes were too old for her small face. Eliza looked away first. There had been a time when she would have answered faster. Before her husband rode away with 2 good horses, the winter wheat money, and a note that said the farm had become too small for him. Before neighbors started visiting only to ask what she planned to sell. Before she learned that every kindness could become a debt someone else tried to collect. She had not let a man sleep under her roof since. The wind shoved rain across the porch and made the lantern flame jump. "Your wife?" Eliza asked. Silas lowered his eyes. "Gone 3 winters." He did not say more. He did not dress the grief up for sympathy. He only stood there, soaked to the bone, with one boot half buried in the mud and one hand still steadying the broken wagon. Eliza hated how much that silence told her. She stepped down from the porch. Mud sucked at the hem of her dark skirt. She walked to the gate but stopped with one hand on the latch. "3 rules," she said. "You do not touch my livestock unless I say so. You do not open my tool house. You do not wander my land after dark." Silas nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." "At first light, if the road allows it, you leave." "Yes, ma'am." Only then did Eliza open the gate. The mare gave a tired little breath as Silas led her in. Eliza noticed the way he kept the animal slow, not dragging, not forcing. He spoke softly near the mare's ear, though the storm tore the words apart before Eliza could hear them. Annie tried to climb down from the wagon by herself. Her boot slipped on the wet iron step. Silas reached for her, but Eliza was closer. She caught the girl beneath both arms, light as a bundle of kindling, and set her carefully on the ground. Annie stared up at her. "Thank you, ma'am." Her voice was small but not weak. Eliza looked at the tin cup in the child's hands. "You can bring that inside." Annie's fingers tightened around it. "It was my mama's." Eliza said nothing. She only turned toward the house before the girl could see what had changed in her face. Inside, the kitchen held the deep warmth of a working stove. The smell of beans and yesterday's cornbread hung in the room. Rain tapped the windows. Somewhere outside, a loose barn board knocked again and again, steady as a nervous heart. Eliza pointed Silas toward the wash basin. "You'll drip half the prairie onto my floor. I can stay outside until I'm drier. You'll freeze standing polite. Wash." He obeyed without another word. That was the second thing she noticed. Most men who needed help still tried to sound like they owned the room. Silas Boone did not. He moved like a man careful not to take more space than he had been given. Eliza fetched an old shirt and pair of trousers from a cedar chest in the back room. They had belonged to her father, folded away for years with the smell of wood and dry lavender. She laid them over a chair. Silas started to refuse. Eliza cut him off. "I don't intend to nurse a fever by morning." His mouth closed. "Thank you." Annie sat near the stove, boots held just above the floor as if even her mud might be a crime. Eliza placed a towel beneath the girl's feet. "May I?" Annie asked. Eliza looked at her. Such a small question, such a careful child. "Yes," Eliza said, quieter now, "you may." She knelt and wiped mud from Annie's boots before she could stop herself. The girl held perfectly still. When Eliza finished, Annie tried to dry her own hair, but her hands trembled too badly and the towel slipped into her lap. Eliza took one end of it. "Hold the other side," she said. Together, they dried the rain from the girl's hair without another word. Silas returned in the dry clothes, carrying his wet things folded over one arm. He looked embarrassed by the borrowed shirt which hung loose at the shoulders. "Where can these drip without hurting anything?" he asked. Eliza pointed near the stove. Supper was quiet at first. Eliza put beans into 3 bowls, then cut the last piece of salt pork smaller than she wanted to. Annie waited until Silas lifted his spoon before she touched her food. When she did, she pulled the dented tin cup close to her bowl and set it beside her like a guard. "When did you last eat proper?" Eliza asked. "This morning," Silas said. Annie looked down. Eliza did not call him a liar. She simply took the pot from the stove and spooned more beans into the child's bowl. Outside, the wind struck the house so hard that the lantern swayed on its hook. Silas glanced toward the window. "That north wall takes the worst of it. It has stood through worse." "I believe it." The way he said it made Eliza look at him, not arguing, not correcting, just noticing. After supper, she showed Annie the little room beside the kitchen. The bed was narrow and plain, with a quilt folded at the foot. Annie stood in the doorway, staring at it as though it were too fine to touch. "You can sleep there," Eliza said. "Inside. For tonight." Annie nodded, but she did not move until Silas came and rested one hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he whispered. Eliza turned away before the ache in her chest could become visible. Silas took the narrow sofa in the front room. Before Eliza went to her own room, she slipped the ring of keys from its nail by the stove and tucked it into her apron pocket. Silas saw it. He said nothing. That silence mattered too. Near midnight, Eliza woke to a whisper through the wall. "Papa!" She held her breath. Silas was awake at once. His footsteps crossed the floor, soft and careful. "I'm here, Annie. Are we leaving tomorrow?" A pause followed, long enough for a father to hide fear from his child. "If the road lets us." "What if it does?" "Then I'll find a way." The little girl's voice trembled. "Do good people ever let you stay twice?" Silas did not answer right away. Eliza stared into the dark, one hand resting over the keys in her apron pocket. At last Silas said, "Sometimes, sweetheart, good people are tired. We must not ask too much of them." The words settled through the wall and found a place inside Eliza she had kept locked for years. For almost a decade, Sparrow Bend Farm had been quiet. She had told herself quiet meant safety. Quiet meant control. Quiet meant no one could leave a cup on her table one morning and disappear by nightfall. But as the rain beat against the roof and the child's breathing slowly softened, Eliza understood something she wished she had not. A silent house was not always a peaceful one. Sometimes it was only a place where no one had asked to stay. Morning did not bring mercy. The rain had stopped before dawn, but the land beyond Sparrow Bend Farm looked as if the whole prairie had turned to wet clay overnight. The road in front of the gate was no longer a road. It was a long brown wound cut through the grass, filled with water, broken wagon tracks, and mud deep enough to hold a horse by the legs. Eliza stood at the gate with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. A pale sun hid behind low clouds. The wind had settled, but the cold stayed sharp in the air, creeping under sleeves and into bones. She pushed the handle of a rake into the road. It sank halfway down before it touched anything firm. Behind her, Silas said nothing. That was becoming a habit with him. He did not fill trouble with easy talk. He looked at it, measured it, and let the truth stand where it was. The bay mare, whose name he had told Annie was Juniper, stood beneath the barn lintel with one front leg resting lightly. Silas had wrapped the strain part with a clean strip of cloth before breakfast and warmed his hands before touching the animal. Eliza had watched from the kitchen window, not wanting to seem like she cared, though she had stood there long enough for the coffee to go cold. "She can't pull today," Silas said at last. "I can see that. Not tomorrow either, unless the swelling goes down." Eliza looked toward the broken wagon near the fence. The rear axle had cracked clean through on one side, and one wheel leaned as though it had lost the will to stand. "You said you would leave at first light if the road allowed it." "Yes, ma'am." "The road does not allow it." "No, ma'am." She disliked how easily he agreed. It left her with no argument to push against. Annie stood by the porch steps in the coat Eliza had lent her, sleeves hanging past her wrists. The girl watched her father with the still face of a child trying to read bad news before anyone spoke it aloud. Silas turned toward Eliza. "Let us stay 2 more days. I'll earn every meal, any chore you name." Eliza's first answer rose quickly, "No." It reached her tongue and stayed there. The farm did need work, more than she liked to admit. The storm had torn loose a strip of roof tin over the chicken shed. Water still ran toward the house instead of away from it. The east fence sagged near the pasture gate. The hand pump handle had begun to grind 3 days ago, and the windmill had not pulled water since late summer. But needing help and accepting it were 2 different things. "What do you know about farm chores?" she asked. Silas glanced toward the barn. "Enough to know a cow's temper before I trust her." Eliza almost smiled, but held it back. She took the milk pail from beside the porch and handed it to him. 2 cows in the east barn, Buttercup and Maud. Buttercup will stand, Maud will test you. Silas took the pail. "What side does Maud favor?" Eliza paused. Most hired hands only asked where the stool was. "Left," she said. He nodded and went to the barn. Eliza followed far enough to watch from the doorway. She told herself it was because strangers should not be trusted near livestock. That was true. It was not the whole truth. Buttercup gave no trouble. Silas spoke low, set his shoulder gently against her side, and milked with steady hands. Maud shifted the moment he approached, swinging her head with suspicion. Silas did not curse her. He did not slap her flank or force the pail beneath her. He stood near her shoulder and let her smell his sleeve. "Fair enough," he murmured. "I don't know you either." Eliza heard it and looked away. After a minute, Maud settled. When Silas began milking, he stopped suddenly and bent closer. "She's tender on this side," he called. Eliza stepped in. "Tender how?" "Not bad yet, warm near the teat. Milk the first draw separate today, wash her after, could turn sour if ignored." Eliza crouched beside him, pressed her fingers carefully, and felt the heat. She had missed it. The knowledge stung more than she expected, not because Silas had found it but because she had not. For years she had believed watching everything herself was the only way to keep the farm alive. Now a stranger in her father's old shirt had spotted trouble in less than 10 minutes. Silas must have seen the change in her face because he lowered his voice. "You would have found it by tomorrow." Eliza stood. "I did not ask for comfort." "No, ma'am." She turned before he could see the shame beneath her annoyance. Inside the kitchen, Annie helped sort beans at the table. She worked slowly, separating stones and spoiled pieces into a chipped saucer. The tin cup sat beside her right hand. Eliza washed her hands at the basin, then noticed Annie watching the towel. "You can use it," Eliza said. Annie reached for the towel, dried her fingers, folded it exactly as it had been, and laid it back in the same place. Eliza watched the movement. "You don't have to ask every time." Annie looked uncertain. "Some folks want you to." The answer was plain and soft, but it made the kitchen feel colder than the morning outside. Eliza picked up the pot and moved it to the stove. "In this house, towels are for drying hands." Annie nodded, as if storing the rule carefully in a place where rules mattered. By noon, Silas had finished with the cows, cleaned the pails, and gone to inspect the water pooling near the north side of the farmhouse. He did not touch a tool. He walked the yard, studying the slope, the gutters, the packed grass where rainwater had been running for years. Eliza came out carrying a basket of wet rags. He straightened. "Your house is drinking water it should be shedding. That house has stood longer than either of us. And it will stand longer if the water runs south." Eliza gave him a hard look. He took one step back from the line he had crossed. "I mean no insult, only that the ground is wrong here." "The ground is not wrong, it is ground." "The grade is wrong then." She hated that she understood him. Silas pointed with his boot, not touching anything. "A shallow trench from this corner to that low patch beyond the garden would carry the next rain away from the foundation." "I said the tool house stays locked." "Yes, ma'am, there's an old shovel by the fence." "That shovel is dull." "It still knows it is a shovel." This time Eliza did smile, though only for a breath. She handed him permission with a nod, then went back inside before it looked like gratitude. For the next several hours the yard filled with the sound of work. The shovel bit into wet earth. Mud lifted, fell, and slapped against the ground. Annie carried drinking water in a small dipper. Eliza measured the line with her eyes from the porch, then finally gave in and came down to correct the path. "Not through the bean patch," she said. Silas stopped at once. "Where?" 3 feet east." He moved without argument. That mattered too. Her husband, Grant Wren, had argued with every correction as though marriage meant he had been given ownership over her judgment. If Eliza said the chickens needed closing before dark, he heard criticism. If she said the west field should be planted late, he heard challenge. By the end, she had learned to say less and carry more. Silas simply shifted the trench 3 feet east and kept digging. Near afternoon, clouds gathered again. A quick cold shower swept over the farm, not heavy but steady enough to test the fresh-cut channel. Eliza stood beneath the porch roof with Annie beside her. Silas stayed out in the rain, leaning on the shovel, watching the ground. Water crossed the yard. For one tense moment, it moved toward the house as it always had. Then it found the trench. A thin stream turned south, sliding through the new cut, carrying bits of grass and silt with it. More water followed. The puddle near the foundation trembled, thinned, and slowly began to drain away from the wall. Annie looked up at Eliza. "It worked." Eliza did not answer. Her eyes stayed on the exposed stones at the corner of the house. For years, after every storm, that corner had remained damp for days. Sometimes frost clung there longer than anywhere else. Sometimes the floor inside felt colder near that wall, though she had never told anyone. Now the water was leaving. Silas came to the porch, rain dripping from his hat brim. He set the shovel aside, careful not to lean it against the house. "It is only a beginning," he said. "The old ditch is filled in farther west. If winter freezes wet soil against that wall, it may lift the stones." Eliza looked at him. "You have been here 1 night and half a day." "I know. And already you are telling me my foundation may fail." "No, ma'am," his voice stayed even. "I am telling you water always tells the truth before wood and stone do." The words unsettled her. Not because they were bold, but because they felt like something she should have known. That evening the kitchen was warmer than the day before. Annie helped lay spoons beside the bowls, then hesitated with the third one. Eliza noticed. For 9 years she had set one place at that table, sometimes 2 when a neighbor came by, never 3 with the feeling that all 3 belonged. "Put it down," Eliza said. Annie placed the spoon carefully. During supper, Silas spoke of practical things: Juniper's leg, the broken axle, the road. He did not ask to stay longer. He did not mention the foundation again. He ate what he was given and thanked her after every serving until she told him once was enough. After the meal, Annie fell asleep in her chair, cheek resting beside her mother's tin cup. Silas moved to lift her, but Eliza was already there. She gathered the girl into her arms. Annie stirred only once, her small hand gripping Eliza's sleeve. "Mama," she whispered. The room went still. Silas froze by the stove. Eliza's breath caught in a place she had thought long dead. Then Annie settled again, still asleep. Eliza carried her to the little room and laid her beneath the quilt. She stood there a moment too long, looking at the child's hand curled near her face. When she returned to the kitchen, Silas was staring down at his hat. "She does that when she's worn out," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." Eliza reached for the lamp and lowered the flame. "Don't apologize for a child missing her mother." He looked up then, and for the first time since he arrived, the tiredness in his face broke through fully. Outside, beyond the warm kitchen walls, the fresh trench whispered with running water in the dark. Inside, Eliza took the ring of keys from her apron pocket and set it on the table beside her ledger. Only for a moment. Only because her side ached from carrying them all day. That was what she told herself. But Silas saw the keys resting there. And just as before, he did not reach for what had not been offered. By the 4th morning, the mud road still had not healed. It lay beyond the gate in thick brown ridges, hardened at the top and soft beneath, the kind of road that tricked a wagon into trusting it before swallowing the wheels. Juniper's strained leg had improved, but when Silas led her across the yard, the mare still placed her hoof down with care. Eliza saw it from the porch and folded her arms. "You won't make red willow on that leg." Silas looked from the horse to the road. No. He did not ask. That made the decision harder. A man begging gave Eliza something to refuse. A man waiting with quiet honesty left her standing face to face with her own conscience. She glanced toward the barn, toward the house corner where the new trench had drawn water away through 2 more light showers, then toward the tool house with its locked door. The farm had begun speaking louder now that someone had arrived who could hear its troubles. A sagging fence near the west pasture. A loose hinge on the corn crib. The windmill turning above the well without bringing up so much as a mouthful of water. "How long before the mare can travel?" she asked. 2 days, maybe 3. "And your wagon?" Silas looked at the cracked axle, longer without a forge. "Elmer Pike has one in town. He the blacksmith. The best between here and North Platte if you catch him before whiskey does." Silas nodded once. "Then I can walk in and ask about the axle." "You will not leave your girl here alone." "I was not going to." Eliza heard the sharpness in her own voice. She looked away first. Annie came out of the kitchen carrying a small pan of scraps for the barn cat, an old gray creature with one torn ear and a face that suggested disappointment in every living soul. The cat had watched Silas and Annie with suspicion since their arrival. This morning, it sat near the porch steps and allowed Annie to place the pan 2 feet away. "What's his name?" Annie asked. "He never told me." The girl looked deeply impressed by that. "Then maybe he is important." "He is troublesome. Sometimes important things are." Eliza had no answer for that, so she went inside. Later that morning, Silas stood beneath the windmill tower looking up as the blades moved slowly against the pale sky. The wheel turned. The rod shifted. The old iron made a tired clicking sound, but the trough below remained dry. Eliza came to the yard with a bucket in each hand. "It quit in July," she said. "A repairman came through before harvest and said the pump rod down the well was worn too bad, said the whole thing needed pulling. That would cost plenty. More than I had." Silas shaded his eyes with one hand. "May I inspect what can be reached from above?" Eliza's hand moved toward the key ring at her waist. He noticed. "I won't open the tool house," he added. She disliked that he knew her fear well enough to step around it gently. "What will you need?" "A wrench if you allow it, maybe oil, maybe nothing but a better look." Eliza stood still for a long moment. Then she went to the tool house, unlocked it herself, and brought out the wrench and oil can. She did not hand him the keys. She did not apologize for keeping them. Silas accepted the tools as though they were worth trust, not insult. He climbed the tower carefully, testing each rung before adding weight. The wind tugged at his coat. Below, Annie stood with both hands pressed against her chest, watching every movement. Eliza watched too, though she pretended to check the trough. For nearly half an hour, Silas examined the moving parts. He did not rush. He wiped away old grease. He turned the mechanism by hand. He leaned close to the pitman rod and watched it travel its stroke again and again. When he came down, his palms were black with oil. "Well," Eliza asked. "The tower is sound, the wheel is sound, the gearbox is tired but not dead. And the pump? Maybe fine, maybe not, but that rod is bent just enough to rob the stroke." Eliza looked up. "That little bend stopped the water." "That little bend means the pump below never gets a clean pull, like trying to lift a bucket with your elbow crooked." The other man said the problem was underground. "He may still be right." Silas wiped his hands on a rag. "But I would not spend money digging for trouble before I fix the trouble waving at me in daylight." Eliza wanted to distrust the hope rising in her chest. Hope had been expensive in her life. It had made her believe Grant would come home after the first week, then after the first month, then by Christmas, then never again, though she still caught herself looking toward the road whenever hoofbeats passed after dark. "What would it take?" she asked. "A forge to straighten the rod, a fresh leather cup if the old one dried out, a half day if nothing else is wrong." "And if something else is wrong?" "Then we learn the next truth." That answer stayed with her longer than she expected. By noon, Eliza had hitched her small buckboard to the farm's older mare and driven Silas into Cottonwood Crossing while Annie stayed beside her on the seat. Eliza told herself she brought the girl because Silas was right not to leave her. She did not admit that the house already felt strange when Annie was not inside it. Town sat low against the prairie, a row of weathered storefronts, hitching rails, a church steeple, and a blacksmith shop whose chimney smoked even in fair weather. As they drove in, faces turned. Eliza felt them before she met them. Mrs. Hattie Bell from the mercantile window, 2 cattle hands outside the feed store, Mr. Tull from the bank steps. Eyes moving from Eliza to Silas to Annie, gathering questions the way dry grass gathered burrs. Eliza kept her chin level. At the forge, Elmer Pike came out wiping his hands on a leather apron. His beard was singed at one corner, and his eyes were clearer than Eliza had hoped. "What broke this time, Miss Wren?" "The windmill rod, maybe a wagon axle after." Elmer looked at Silas. "This yours?" "The wagon is mine," Silas said. The windmill is hers. Eliza noticed the distinction, so did Elmer. Inside the forge, Silas explained what he had found. He did not act like a man showing off. He simply laid the bent rod across the bench, marked the warp with chalk, and asked whether the iron would take heat without cracking. Elmer listened with growing respect. "Not bad," the blacksmith muttered. "Who taught you?" "My father first, then every broken pump between Texas and Dakota." While the men worked, Annie stood near the doorway, keeping well back from the sparks. Eliza bought nails from the mercantile and a small twist of peppermint from Hattie Bell, who placed it on the counter with a slow smile. "Company at the farm, Eliza." "For a few days." "A few days can grow long when folks are lonely." Eliza's eyes cooled. So can a conversation. Hattie's smile faded. On the ride home, Annie unwrapped the peppermint and broke it in two. She offered half to Eliza without speaking. Eliza hesitated, then took it. It tasted sharp and sweet, like something remembered from childhood. By late afternoon, the windmill rod had been heated, straightened, cooled, and fitted back into place. Silas had cut a new leather cup from an old strip Elmer gave him, soaking it in oil until it softened. Eliza stood near the trough with Annie beside her. Elmer had followed them out, curious enough to watch the final test. Silas climbed down from the tower and gave the wheel a push. The blades turned. The rod moved straight. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the pipe coughed. A thick burst of muddy water splashed into the trough, dark as coffee and full of grit. Annie gasped and reached forward. "Not yet," Silas said gently. "Let it run clean." The pump coughed again, then again. Muddy water became cloudy water. Cloudy water became pale water. Then, with a steady rush that made Eliza's throat tighten, clear water poured into the trough. Annie laughed. It was the first true laugh Eliza had heard from her. The sound rang across the yard, startling the barn cat from beneath the porch. Even Elmer grinned and rubbed his beard. Eliza stepped closer and held her hand beneath the stream. Cold water struck her palm, real water, running water. Water she no longer had to carry in 2 aching buckets from the hand pump every morning before sunrise. She looked at Silas. He stood back from the trough, oil on his sleeves, dirt on his cheek, eyes lowered as if he did not want to claim too much of the moment. "You fixed it," she said. "I fixed what I could see." "You always answer small when the truth is large." Silas looked up, surprised. Before he could speak, a rider appeared at the west fence. Martin Vale drew his horse to a stop beside the gate. He owned the next ranch over, a broad stretch of land he had been trying to widen for years. He looked at the running water, then at Silas, then at Eliza. "Well," Martin called, voice smooth as a closed knife. "Seems the widow's farm has found itself a hired man." Eliza stiffened. Silas stayed quiet. Martin's eyes moved to Annie, who had gone still beside the trough, one hand slipping into her pocket around the tin cup she kept there. "How long you planning to keep strangers under your roof, Eliza?" The yard changed. The water still ran, the windmill still turned, but the warmth from Annie's laugh vanished as quickly as breath in cold air. Eliza stepped down from the trough and placed herself between Martin Vale and the child. "That," she said, calm and hard, "is not a question for you to ask from my gate." Martin smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "No harm meant. Then see that none is done." For a moment only the windmill spoke, creaking slowly above them as clear water filled the trough. And Silas Boone, who had repaired the farm's first broken thing, finally saw the trouble Eliza had been fighting long before he came through the rain. Martin Vale did not ride away at once. He sat at Eliza's gate with one gloved hand resting on the saddle horn, his horse shifting beneath him as if even the animal felt the coldness that had entered the yard. The windmill turned behind Silas with a slow iron rhythm, pouring clean water into a trough that had been dry for months. Martin looked at it like a man studying a door he had not expected to see unlocked. "You always did have a way of taking offense where none was given," he said. Eliza stood between him and Annie. "And you always had a way of dressing offense in neighborly words." The corner of Martin's mouth twitched. He was not a cruel-looking man. That made him more difficult. He wore a fine brown coat, kept his beard trimmed, and tipped his hat at church ladies. He brought flour to families in hardship and lent fence wire after storms. But Eliza had learned that kindness could be used like a rope if a man expected to pull something back with it. Martin had been asking about her west field for 2 years. First, he wanted to rent it through winter, then to graze cattle on it, then to buy it for her own good, as if a woman who had kept land alive alone could not understand what land was worth. His eyes moved again to Sela's. "You from around here?" "No," Sela's answered. "Passing through." That was the plan. Martin gave a soft laugh. Plans change fast when a man finds a warm stove. Sela's face did not change, but Eliza saw his hand tighten slightly around the rag he had been using to wipe oil from the pump rod. She spoke before he could. "Sela's repaired my windmill. He earned his meals." "I can see he's been busy." Martin leaned in the saddle. "A farm like this can make a body grateful in a hurry, especially when a man arrives with no money and a child to feed." Annie's shoulders drew inward. That small movement ended Eliza's patience. "You will not speak about his child from my gate." Martin looked at her, then at Annie, then back again. For the first time, a little embarrassment crossed his face. He lifted one hand. "No harm meant to the girl." "Then leave her out of your meaning." The wind pushed across the yard, carrying the smell of wet earth and fresh iron from the windmill. Martin straightened in the saddle. "I came to check after the storm, that is all." "You have checked." His jaw tightened. "You may not like advice, Eliza, but you need some. A woman alone has to be careful who she lets near her property." "I was careful before you rode over, and I will be careful after you leave." Martin's gaze went toward the tool house, then the barn, then the water running bright into the trough. "This place is too much for one pair of hands." "It has been my pair of hands keeping it standing." "And for how long? Another winter, too?" His voice softened, and somehow that made it worse. "Lease me the west field just through spring. You would have money in your pocket and less burden on your back." Silas turned slightly, but he did not speak. Eliza noticed. He understood this was not his fight to claim. That too mattered. "My west field is not for lease," she said. Martin's expression cooled. "You might feel different when the first hard snow comes." "Then you may ask the snow." For a moment Martin looked as though he had more to say. Then he tipped his hat, though his eyes stayed sharp. "Evening, Miss Wren." He turned his horse and rode west, his tracks cutting through the wet ground beyond the gate. Annie did not move until he disappeared over the low rise. Then she looked up at Eliza. "Did I do something wrong?" The question struck Eliza harder than Martin's words. "No," she said at once, then softer, "No, child. Some grown people ask questions in the wrong direction." Annie's fingers loosened from the tin cup in her pocket, but she still looked worried. Silas stepped closer, stopping a respectful distance away. "I am sorry my being here brought talk to your gate." Eliza looked at him. "Talk knew the road before you did." He gave a faint nod, but his eyes held guilt anyway. That evening the farm felt different. Not unsafe exactly, but awake. As if Martin's visit had reminded every wall, every fence post, every locked door that Sparrow Bend was not only fighting weather, it was fighting men who smiled while waiting for it to fail. After supper, Annie helped wash the bowls. She stood on her toes at the basin until Eliza placed an overturned crate beneath her feet. The girl smiled, small and sudden. "I can reach now." "That crate wobbles." "I'll be careful." Silas looked up from the table where he had been sketching the wagon axle on a scrap of brown wrapping paper. I can make her a proper step stool tomorrow from spare wood. Eliza dried a bowl. You are already fixing a wagon and a farm. A stool is smaller than both. It is still work. He looked toward Annie. Some work pays better than money. Eliza turned away before he saw her face. Later, when Annie had gone to bed, Eliza opened the pantry and counted sacks by lantern light. Flour, beans, salt, dried corn, coffee, sugar wrapped tight in paper. She wrote each amount in her ledger with careful lines. Silas sat across the table, mending a tear in his coat sleeve with clumsy but patient stitches. He was bad at sewing. Eliza watched him stab the needle too close to the edge. That will rip again by Tuesday. He paused and studied the crooked stitch. Likely. She held out her hand. Give it here. He hesitated. Not long, but enough for her to notice that receiving help troubled him more than giving it. At last he passed the coat across. Eliza took the needle and thread. A seam needs more than closing, it needs holding. Silas watched her hands move. My wife used to say something like that. The room went quiet except for the stove. Eliza kept sewing. What was her name? Rose. The name landed gently. Silas looked toward the dark window. She had a laugh that came before the joke was finished. Used to say if she waited to laugh, the world might change its mind and take the chance away. Eliza tied off the thread and cut it with small scissors. Annie remembers her. Pieces? His voice grew lower. A song, the smell of peppermint, that tin cup, not much else. Sometimes I tell her stories, but I fear I'm giving her my memory instead of her own. Eliza slid the coat back to him. A child can live on borrowed memory until her own grows strong enough. Silas looked at her then, deeply, as if she had said something kinder than she meant to. For a while neither of them spoke. Then he nodded toward the ledger. You count everything every night. Everything that keeps us alive. Us. Eliza's pencil stopped. The word had left her mouth without permission. She looked down at the ledger, the farm. Silas did not smile, he did not tease her. He only accepted the correction and lowered his gaze to his sleeve. I understand. But Eliza knew he had heard it. The next morning brought a brittle kind of cold. Frost silvered the fence rails, though the sun had barely risen. Silas went to inspect the drainage trench after breakfast and found the water had cut a deeper channel near the garden turn. If left alone, it could widen in the next storm and eat into the bean patch. He came inside and told Eliza before touching a shovel. That simple act did more to earn trust than the windmill had. Together they walked the line. He explained the problem, drawing with a stick in the dirt. If we set flat stones here, the water slows instead of bites, then it turns south without chewing the bank. Eliza studied the ground. Where would you get the stones? Old pile behind the smokehouse, if you permit it. She looked toward the smokehouse. Grant had stacked those stones years ago, promising to repair the broken back step. He never did. For 9 years they had sat under weeds, useless and stubborn like a memory refusing to rot. Use them, she said. Silas looked once at her face, perhaps hearing something beneath the words. Then he nodded. They spent most of the morning clearing the stones. Eliza wore gloves, but the cold still burned through the leather. Silas lifted the larger rocks while she placed smaller ones along the trench wall. Annie gathered pebbles in her apron and delivered them with great importance. The barn cat followed them from a distance, judging the entire operation. By noon, the repaired bend held firm. Water from melting frost trickled through and turned south exactly as Silas had said it would. Annie clapped her hands. It listens now. Silas smiled. Water never listens, it only goes where the ground invites it. Eliza stood, brushing mud from her skirt. That sounds like something a man says when he wants to seem wise. It may be something a tired man says when he is hungry. Annie laughed again. Eliza felt that laugh move through the yard like sunlight. If this moment touched your heart, stay with the story, because some homes are not rebuilt with wood and nails alone. Sometimes they begin with a child laughing where silence used to live. That afternoon, Elmer Pike arrived with the repaired wagon axle in the back of his cart. He climbed down, eyed the windmill, the trench, the stones, and then Sela's. "You still here?" "Rhoda had other ideas," Sela said. Elmer grunted. "Roads usually do." They worked near the wagon until the light turned gold. Elmer shaped a brace. Sela's fitted the new iron. Eliza handed tools when asked but kept the tool house key in her pocket. No one questioned it. By sundown, the wagon stood straighter. Annie ran one hand along the sideboard as if greeting an old friend. "Can it go now?" Silas wiped grease from his fingers. "Soon." The word should have brought relief. Instead, the yard seemed to lose warmth. Eliza looked toward the house. The kitchen window glowed soft in the early dark. 3 cups waited on the table because Annie had set them there before going outside. "Soon." The word followed Eliza into the kitchen and sat beside her through supper. After the dishes were done, Silas stepped onto the porch. Eliza joined him a moment later, pulling her shawl tight. The sky had cleared and the stars looked close enough to catch on the barn roof. The windmill creaked softly in the dark, drawing water into the trough with steady faithfulness. "You have done more than 2 days' work," she said. "I owed more than 2 days' shelter." "You owe nothing for keeping a child warm." Silas looked down at his hat in his hands. "I owe for that most of all." Eliza did not know what to do with the ache in his voice. Before she could answer, a sound came from inside the house. A cough. Then another. Small, dry, and sharp. Silas turned at once. Eliza's heart tightened. Annie coughed again from the little room beside the kitchen, and the sound carried through the quiet farmhouse like winter tapping its first warning on the door. Annie's cough did not sound dangerous at first. It was small and dry, the kind of cough a child might get from cold air, wet clothes, or too much running in a yard where the wind never truly rested. But Silas moved before the second cough finished. He crossed the kitchen so quickly his chair scraped against the floorboards. Eliza followed with the lamp. The little room beside the kitchen was dim and warm, but Annie sat upright beneath the quilt, one hand pressed to her chest. Her dark hair clung in loose strands around her face. The tin cup rested on the small table beside the bed. Silas sat carefully on the edge of the mattress. "Easy, sweetheart." "I'm not sick," Annie whispered, though another cough caught her before she could finish. Eliza lifted the lamp closer and studied the child's cheeks. Pale, not flushed, eyes tired but clear, she touched Annie's forehead with the back of her fingers. "No fever yet." Silas looked at her. "Yet." Wet cold has a way of waiting before it shows its teeth. His face changed at that. Not fear exactly, something older than fear, something practiced. Eliza had seen men panic before. She had seen men curse storms, slam doors, shout at horses, and pretend anger could hold back helplessness. Silas did none of that. He became very still. Only his hands betrayed him, one thumb rubbing the edge of his sleeve again and again, as if trying to wear through the cloth. "I should not have let her stand outside so long today," he said. "She was not out longer than the rest of us. She is smaller than the rest of us." Eliza heard what he was really saying. "I should have known. I should have stopped it. I should have saved someone once before and did not." She set the lamp on the table. "Regret does not warm a child, broth does." Silas looked up. Eliza turned toward the kitchen. "Sit with her." The next hour became quiet work. Eliza added water to a small pot, shaved in dried onion, salt, and the last bits of chicken saved from Sunday. She took a jar of honey from the pantry and a bundle of dried horehound from the top shelf. Her mother had used it for coughs, though Eliza had never liked the bitter taste. She brewed it anyway. Behind her, she heard Silas talking softly to Annie. Not stories, not cheerful lies, just little steady words. You breathe slow, that's it. In through your nose if you can. Good girl, no, the wagon is fine, Juniper is resting. No, I'm not going anywhere. Eliza paused with the spoon in her hand. No, I'm not going anywhere. The words were ordinary, they should not have hurt. But there were some promises Eliza had not heard in so long that even hearing them given to someone else made her chest tight. When the broth was ready, she carried it into the room. Annie took 3 small sips and made a face at the horehound tea. That tastes like a fence post, the girl murmured. Silas almost smiled. Have you been eating fence posts? No. Then you cannot know. Annie gave him the faintest look of offense, and Eliza felt something warm move through the worry in the room. By midnight the cough eased. Annie slept again, though restlessly. Silas remained in the chair beside the bed. Eliza brought him a blanket. You'll ruin your back sleeping there. I've slept in worse places. That is not an argument for doing it again. He accepted the blanket but did not move from the chair. Eliza stood near the doorway for a moment. Rose died of fever. Silas's eyes stayed on Annie. Yes. Was it fast? No, his voice went rough. That was the mercy I asked for and did not get. Eliza said nothing. The lamp flame trembled. Outside, a horse shifted in the barn, and the wind leaned against the house with a low moan. I was fixing a pump 12 miles away when she first took sick, Silas continued. She told the neighbor not to send for me unless it turned bad. She thought she was saving me from losing the work. By the time I got home, she was burning up and trying to smile so Annie would not be afraid. His hand closed slowly over the arm of the chair. I rode for the doctor. Snow came, horse went lame. I walked the last mile. When we got back, she was still alive. He swallowed for half an hour. Eliza's throat tightened. Silas looked down. Ever since, if something breaks, I fix it before it can cost more. If a latch is loose, I mend it. If a roof leaks, I patch it. If a child coughs, I sit there counting breaths like a fool because I cannot tell which small thing will become the thing that takes everything. Eliza understood then why he watched the world so closely, why he saw bent rods, bad drainage, tender cows, and weak seams. He was not only a repairman, he was a man still trying to outrun the one repair he had not made in time. She spoke quietly, "You are not a fool." His eyes lifted. "You are a father." The words settled between them. No comfort was large enough to cover what he had lost, but this one small truth seemed to reach him. Eliza went back to the kitchen, but sleep did not come. She sat at the table with the ledger open, though she did not read the numbers. Across the room, the ring of keys rested on its nail. She had hung them there earlier out of habit, but now they seemed heavier than when she wore them. For 9 years, every locked door had been proof that nothing could be taken from her without her knowing. The pantry, the tool house, the cellar, the smokehouse, the small drawer where Grant's note still lay folded beneath old receipts because she had never found the courage to burn it. Keys were not only keys, they were warnings, they were walls, they were the shape her heart had taken after being abandoned. Near dawn, Annie's cough softened into sleep. Silas stepped quietly into the kitchen. His face looked worn but calmer. "No fever," he said. Eliza nodded. "Good." He looked toward the stove. "You should sleep, I can tend the fire." "This is my house." "I know." The answer was gentle, not challenging. He moved toward the woodbox and added a split log to the stove. He did it with care, not making noise, not acting like the room belonged to him. Then he stepped back. Eliza watched him. "You do that often," she said. "What?" "Help as if you are afraid help might offend someone." Silas gave a tired breath that was almost a laugh. "Sometimes it does." "Not always." No, he looked toward Annie's room. "Not always." By morning, the sky had cleared and the farm glittered with frost. Annie stayed in bed, wrapped in the quilt with the barn cat sitting just outside her door like a gray judge appointed to supervise recovery. She insisted she was well enough to help. Eliza told her that sorting beans from a pillow counted as heavy labor for the day. Silas went to the barn after breakfast to check Juniper's leg and the repaired wagon. Eliza watched him through the window. He moved slower than usual from lack of sleep, but still stopped to lower the barn latch when it caught, then rubbed Juniper's neck before stepping away. That afternoon, a visitor came. Prudence Whitcomb arrived in a small covered buggy, wrapped in a dark wool cloak with a basket on the seat beside her. She was the kind of woman who entered every home with bread in one hand and questions in the other. She had helped Eliza after Grant left, bringing preserves, lamp oil, and enough advice to fill a grain bin. Eliza respected her. That did not mean she trusted her with everything. Prudence stepped down and looked first at the repaired windmill, then at the wagon, then at Silas's coat hanging near the porch rail while he worked by the barn. "Eliza," she said warmly, "I heard you had taken in travelers. For a few nights." Prudence held up the basket. "I brought molasses bread and cough syrup. Hattie mentioned the little girl looked poorly yesterday in town. News travels faster than medicine." Prudence gave a thin smile. Concern travels fastest of all. Inside the kitchen, Annie sat near the stove with the quilt around her shoulders, sorting beans into 2 bowls. Her tin cup rested on the table. She looked up as Prudence entered and immediately drew the cup closer. Prudence noticed. She noticed everything. "My poor child," she said, "you must have had a hard road." Annie nodded politely. Prudence turned to Eliza and the father. "Working in the barn. For wages. For meals and shelter." Prudence set the basket down with a soft thump. "Eliza, may I speak plain?" "You usually do." "A woman alone must guard more than her property. People are already wondering. People have survived years of wondering about me." "This is different." Prudence lowered her voice, though not enough. "A man with no known past sleeping under your roof, handling your tools, repairing your outbuildings. Gratitude can cloud good sense." Eliza looked toward Annie. The child's eyes had dropped to the beans, but her small shoulders had gone stiff. She understood enough. Children always did. "Silas has done honest work," Eliza said. "Honest work is not the same as an honest life." The words hung in the kitchen. Annie's fingers closed around the dented cup. Eliza's voice became calm in the way prairie skies became calm before lightning. "Do not speak as if his guilt is waiting only for proof. I am trying to protect you. Protection that shames a child at my table is not protection." Prudence flushed. "I meant no harm." "No one ever does when the harm is easy." Silence followed. The stove popped softly. Outside, Silas's hammer stopped for one beat, then started again. He had heard. Eliza knew he had heard. Still, he did not come inside to defend himself. Prudence gathered her gloves. Her face held hurt now, and Eliza did not enjoy causing it. "I brought bread," Prudence said quietly. "And I thank you for it. I brought warning too." "I heard that part first." Prudence looked as if she might answer, then thought better of it. She placed the cough syrup on the table and left the basket behind. When the buggy rolled away, the kitchen remained tight with all that had been said. Annie stared at the beans. Eliza sat across from her. "You did nothing wrong." The girl nodded, but her eyes shone. "My papa fixes things," she whispered. "He does not steal them." "I know." Annie looked up quickly. "You do." Eliza thought of the windmill, the trench, the tender cow, the way Silas had stood outside the room all morning instead of entering a conversation where he had not been invited. "Yes," she said, "I do." For a moment, Annie seemed unsure what to do with being believed. Then Eliza opened the small drawer beside the stove. It held matches, string, 2 dull pencils, and a folded recipe for biscuits her mother had written years ago. "If you want," Eliza said, "your cup can stay here while you work. No one will touch it without asking." Annie stared at the drawer. The cup had traveled with her through rain, mud, hunger, strange roads, and strange rooms. She had held it like a shield, like proof that her mother had once existed, like something the world could still take if she relaxed her grip. Slowly, she set the cup inside the drawer. Eliza closed it gently, but not all the way. "Your drawer," she said. Annie's mouth trembled. Then she reached across the table and placed one small hand over Eliza's. It lasted only a second before the girl pulled back, embarrassed by her own need, but Eliza felt the touch long after it left. If you believe one small kindness can change the way a wounded heart breathes, give this story a like and stay with it. The hardest winter has not arrived yet, and the truth about this farm is only beginning to rise. That night, after Annie's cough had nearly disappeared and Sela's returned from the barn, the three of them ate Prudence's molasses bread with supper. No one said it was sweet. No one needed to. After Annie went to bed, Sela's remained near the kitchen door with his hat in his hands. "I heard what Mrs. Whitcomb said," he told Eliza. "I know. I can sleep in the barn from now on." Eliza looked at him. "Is that what you think I want?" "I think your life was simpler before I knocked at your gate." "My life was quieter." He waited. She looked toward the small drawer beside the stove, where Annie's tin cup rested for the first time without being clutched in fear. Then Eliza reached into her apron pocket, took out the tool house key, and placed it on the table between them. Sela stared at it. "I need the corncrib hinge repaired tomorrow," she said, "and the north cellar wall checked before the hard freeze." He did not touch the key. "Are you sure?" "No," Eliza answered honestly, "but I am tired of letting fear make every decision before I do." Silas looked at her, and something in his face softened, not with victory but with care. At last he picked up the key. Outside, the wind moved through the dark fields, cold and patient. Inside, for the first time in 9 years, Eliza Wren had given a piece of trust to someone who could still choose to break it. Trust did not change the farm all at once. The next morning, Eliza still woke before sunrise. She still counted the stove wood before boiling coffee. She still checked the pantry latch twice and looked through the frost-white kitchen window toward the barn before stepping outside. The ring of keys still hung from her apron, familiar against her hip. But one key was missing from the ring. Sela's had it. That small absence followed her through the morning like a second heartbeat. He did not use it carelessly. After breakfast, he came to the table where Eliza was cutting salt pork into thin strips. "I'll check the cellar wall now, if you still want it done." Eliza kept her eyes on the knife. "I gave you the key for that reason." "I know, I'm asking before I open it." The knife stopped. Across the room, Annie looked up from the slate where she was practicing sums. The barn cat sat on the windowsill, tail twitching as if judging everyone's arithmetic. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron. "Then open it." Silas nodded and left. It was a simple thing, asking before using what had been given, yet it sat in Eliza's chest with unexpected weight. Grant had never asked once he believed something was his. A tool, a horse, a field, a woman's patience. To him, permission was a door a man walked through once and never looked back at. Silas carried permission like something living. The root cellar lay behind the house, half sunk into the earth, its wooden door swollen from years of wet seasons. Eliza followed after a few minutes with a lantern, telling herself he might need light. In truth, she needed to see what the key had opened. The cellar smelled of earth, apples, potatoes, and old damp stone. Shelves lined the walls. Baskets of onions rested near the back. Jars of beans and preserves stood in neat rows, each one marked in Eliza's careful hand. Silas crouched by the north wall, touching the lower stones. Water came through here. Last spring. More than once. Eliza said nothing. He looked over his shoulder. I'm not accusing you of hiding it. I did not think you were. But she had a little. He turned back to the wall. This board is soft, that one too. The stone is sound enough, but the water has been sitting behind it. If the cold comes hard, it may push inward. Eliza lifted the lantern higher. Can it be fixed? Yes. That word should have comforted her. Instead, it frightened her. How? Drain what sits low, replace the rotten boards, brush lime wash over the damp stone to sweeten it, seal the cracks where water enters. Eliza nodded. Do it. Silas paused. There is one more thing. What? The old vent on the north side was sealed. My husband sealed it, said cold air spoiled food. Too much cold will, too much damp will too. Eliza's jaw tightened. He was wrong often, but not always. I'm not saying he was wrong. You just said the vent matters. I said damp matters. I need to understand the air before I change it. It was the gentlest disagreement she had ever heard, and somehow the hardest to push aside. They worked through the day. Silas carried out the spoiled boards. Eliza scrubbed the stone. Annie stayed at the top of the steps, handing down rags and asking serious questions about every jar as if she had been appointed cellar clerk by the county. By noon, her cough had faded almost entirely, though Eliza still made her wear a scarf. Silas sealed the visible gaps near the stone base, then set new boards into place. He left the old vent shut for the time being. That evening the cellar looked better than it had in years. The earth floor was dry to the touch. The shelves stood firm. The smell of dampness had eased. Eliza felt almost light when she locked the cellar door. 3 days later, the trouble announced itself in a whisper. Annie had gone down after supper to fetch potatoes. She came back up slowly with the basket in both hands and a troubled look on her face. Miss Eliza. Eliza turned from the stove. What is it? The apples smell funny. Silas, who had been shaping a small wooden step stool near the fire, set down his knife at once. They went to the cellar together. At first, Eliza saw nothing wrong. The walls were dry, no puddle shone near the north stones, no jar had leaked. Then Annie lifted the cloth from one apple basket. 2 apples at the bottom had softened. Brown spots spread under the skin, and a faint sour sweetness rose into the air. Eliza's disappointment became anger so quickly she barely felt the change. You said it was fixed. Silas looked at the apples, then the dry wall, then the sealed vent. I fixed the water. You said the food would keep. No, his voice was quiet. I said the wall would dry. Eliza turned on him. Do not split words with me. Annie flinched. The moment Eliza saw it, shame cut through her anger. She lowered her voice, but it still trembled. This food is winter. I know. If rot starts, it spreads. I know. You had the key, you made the repair. Silas accepted every word, as if each one belonged to him. Then he said, I stopped the cellar from drowning, and I stopped it from breathing. The anger in Eliza faltered. He did not blame old work. He did not blame Grant. He did not blame the weather, the stone, or bad luck. I made half a repair, he said. Half a repair can turn into a whole mistake. Silence filled the cellar. Eliza looked at the basket. Only 2 apples spoiled so far, maybe 3, still enough to frighten her. Food was not comfort on the frontier. Food was survival measured in jars, sacks, and strings hanging from rafters. Silas looked at her directly. Let me make it right. I will explain every change before I touch it. Eliza wanted to say no. She wanted to take back the key, close the cellar, and return to the old safety of trusting only herself. But the old safety had left her with damp stones, a dry windmill, and a house that had been slowly losing warmth for years. Explain first, she said. I will. The next morning, Silas brought a strip of cloth, lit one end from the lantern, then blew it out until it smoked. He held it low near the cellar floor. The smoke rose and gathered under the ceiling, lazy and trapped. See there, he said, it does not leave. The cellar is dry, but the air is standing still. Eliza watched the smoke thicken near the rafters. What does it need? A small low intake and a higher way out. Slow air, not a draft strong enough to freeze the potatoes, just enough to carry damp breath away. Breath. Fruit breathes after harvest. Roots too, in their way, trap that breath with damp air and rot gets invited. Annie stood on the steps, eyes wide. Apples breathe. Silas looked up, quietly, like they are trying not to trouble anyone. Annie seemed to consider this deeply. That sounds like Miss Eliza. Eliza gave her a look. The girl ducked her head, but a smile escaped. They reopened the old north vent, but only halfway. Silas carved a sliding wooden cover so Eliza could narrow it during hard freezes. On the opposite side, he made a higher channel beneath the roof overhang to draw stale air out. He raised the lowest baskets from the ground with scrap slats and moved the jars away from the walls. He set clean sand beneath the apple shelves to catch extra damp. Every change came with an explanation. Every explanation waited for Eliza's nod. 2 days later, Silas lit another strip of cloth. This time the smoke rose, paused near the ceiling, then leaned toward the upper vent and slipped away. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just enough. Annie clapped softly, as if loud sound might break the spell. Eliza checked the baskets the following morning. No new apples had spoiled. The jar lids were dry. The sour smell had faded. Silas did not boast. He simply removed the bad fruit, wiped the basket clean, and hung a small wooden tag beside the cellar door. Eliza read it aloud. Check apples every Monday. Rot is easier to stop when it is still small. She looked at him then. Most things are. Their eyes met in the cool cellar light. Neither spoke of Grant. Neither spoke of Rose. Neither spoke of the strange way this farm seemed to be teaching them both the same lesson through water, wood, stone, and spoiled apples. That evening, Eliza took the cellar key from her apron and placed it on the nail beside the kitchen door. Not back on her ring. Not hidden in her pocket. On the nail. Silas saw it when he came in from the barn. His gaze rested there only a moment before he looked away, careful not to make too much of it. But Annie noticed everything. She set 3 cups on the table for supper, then quietly placed her mother's tin cup in the drawer beside the stove. This time she closed the drawer all the way. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and thin over Sparrow Bend Farm. And far beyond the west field, Martin Vale watched the white sky from his saddle, already wondering how much winter it would take before Eliza Wren finally needed him more than she needed the stranger. Snow came lightly at first. It touched the fence rails, the porch steps, and the backs of the cattle like flour sifted from a careful hand. By noon, much of it melted, leaving the yard wet and shining beneath a pale sky. But Silas did not look at the ground the way Eliza did. He looked at the wind. For nearly an hour after breakfast, he stood north of the barn with his coat collar turned up, watching loose snow slide across the open field. It did not fall where a person expected. It lifted, curled, and swept sideways, gathering in little ridges near the barn door before the sun could soften it. Eliza found him there while carrying a sack of cracked corn. If you stare long enough, will it apologize? She asked. Silas glanced back and a faint smile touched his tired face. No, but it may confess. The weather does not confess. It does, just not in words. Eliza shifted the sack against her hip. And what has it told you? He pointed toward the north side of the barn. The drift will build there when the hard snow comes. It always has. How high? Some years to the lower hinge. Silas looked toward the barn door, then the open field. If it reaches the latch, you will be digging before every feeding. I have dug before. I believe you. Again he said it without pity. That made the words easier to hear. He took a stick and drew a line in the thin snow. A snow fence out there would slow the wind before it reaches the barn. Eliza looked where he pointed, that far. If it stands too close, the snow drops at the barn door. If it stands too far, the wind gathers itself again. She studied the field. How much wood? Not solid wood, gaps matter. Gaps do not stop snow. No, he said, they tell it where to rest. Eliza watched him draw another line, then another, making rough marks in the white dusting. There was a quiet certainty in his movements, but not arrogance. He had been wrong about the cellar, and since then he explained everything as if trust were a lamp that could go out with one careless breath. The north barn wall comes first, she said. It should. And the chicken shed roof. Yes. And the west pasture fence still needs lifting before the cattle push through. Silas nodded. Then we do those, but if there is time after, we build the snow fence. Eliza looked at him. You say we often now. He lowered the stick. For a moment, the cold field seemed to grow quieter around them. I can stop, he said. She did not answer right away. A crow moved across the gray sky, black against the clouds. From inside the barn, Annie's voice drifted out as she spoke softly to Juniper, who had taken to accepting apple peel from the girl's palm. Eliza looked toward the sound, then back at Silas. I did not say I disliked it. The words came out simple, but they warmed the air between them more than either expected. Silas looked down at the line he had drawn. Then we fixed the wall first. For the next week, the farm settled into the kind of work that left no room for pretending. Cold daylight began with chores and ended with aching hands. Silas and Eliza pulled old boards from the north barn wall and packed dry grass and tar paper into the spaces where the wind had been slipping through. They nailed fresh boards over the worst gaps. When the hammer blows echoed through the yard, Annie counted them from the doorway until she lost track. The first evening after the wall was sealed, Eliza stood inside the barn and listened. For years, that wall had hissed whenever the north wind struck it. The animals would crowd away from it, leaving one whole side of the barn nearly useless in deep winter. Now the wall held quiet, not perfect but stronger, warmer. Silas stood beside her, rubbing cold from his fingers. Well, he asked. Eliza looked at the cattle spread more evenly through the shelter. It complains less. That is high praise from a barn. She almost laughed. Not fully, not yet, but enough that Annie, standing outside with a bucket, leaned around the door to see if she had imagined it. The chicken shed roof came next, then the west pasture fence. Eliza worked with the same hard pace she had always kept, but something changed in the way the work felt. Before Silas and Annie arrived, every broken board had been a warning that she was losing ground. Every chore was proof that tomorrow would ask even more of her than today. Now the work remained heavy, but it no longer felt endless. There was someone to hold the other end of the board. Someone to say, "Rest your hand a minute," without making it sound like weakness. Someone to notice when Annie's scarf slipped and tie it again before the cold found her throat. One afternoon, Silas finished the step stool he had promised. It was built from leftover wood, plain and sturdy, with the legs sanded smooth so Annie would not catch her stockings on splinters. He set it by the kitchen basin. There, now you can stop climbing on Eliza's crate. Annie stepped onto it, tested her weight, then looked at him with serious approval. It does not wobble. That was the whole ambition. Eliza folded a dish towel nearby. A man with small ambitions is easier to live beside. Silas looked at her quickly. Beside. The word had come out before she could weigh it. Annie noticed, the barn cat noticed, even the stove seemed to pop louder at that exact moment. Eliza turned toward the pantry. I meant work beside. Silas picked up his hat, hiding the softness in his expression. Of course. But after that day, Annie placed the third cup at the table without asking. Eliza never moved it. The tin cup stayed in the drawer most of the time now, no longer clutched through every meal. Sometimes Annie opened the drawer just to make sure it was there. Sometimes she smiled when she closed it again. By mid-November, the willow snow fence began. Silas chose the line carefully, about 30 yards north of the barn. Eliza drove the first post herself, both hands tight around the mallet, breath showing white in the air. Silas held the post straight and said nothing when her first blow landed crooked. She noticed. "You may speak if it is leaning." "It is leaning." "How much?" "Enough that the wind will laugh." She gave him a sharp look. He met it with calm eyes. Then she adjusted the post and struck again. They worked until sunset painted the field with cold gold. The fence looked strange when it rose from the snow-dusted grass. Not a wall, not a barrier. Thin willow branches woven between posts with open spaces showing through. Martin Vale would have laughed if he had been there. 2 days later he did. He rode by while Silas was tying the last section with rawhide strips. His horse stepped high through the frozen ruts, and his coat looked too fine for the weather. "Well now," Martin called, "building a basket for the prairie." Silas kept his hands on the willow, something like that. Martin looked at Eliza, who was carrying a bundle of branches from the creek bed. "You paying for this foolishness?" "I am building it." "That was not my question." "It was the only answer you needed." Martin's eyes cooled, though his smile remained. "Eliza, I have seen snow fences. That is hardly a fence." Silas stood then. A solid fence would fail quicker. Martin looked him over. "And I suppose you know the mind of snow now." "No," Silas said, "only the habits of wind." Martin gave a short laugh and turned his horse. "When that barn door disappears, send word. I will bring men to dig you out." Eliza's face hardened. "If I need help, I will ask for it." Martin tipped his hat. "That is what worries folks, you ask too late." He rode on before she could answer. For a few moments, the field held only the sound of wind slipping through willow gaps. Silas bent again to tie the rawhide. Eliza stood with the bundle in her arms. "You could have defended the fence more." "It has not worked yet." "You believe it will." "I believe it might. Winter will decide." She looked at him, surprised by the humility of the answer. Grant had never waited for proof before declaring himself right. Martin did not either, but Silas could build a thing with all his care and still leave room for the world to test him. That evening a light snow swept across the farm. Not a storm, just enough to leave white lines along the ground. Before breakfast the next morning, Silas walked the field to study where the snow had gathered. Most of the fence had done exactly what he hoped. Snow rested in a soft drift north of the barn, leaving the doorway mostly clear. But one western section had failed. The wind curled around the edge and dropped snow too close to the side path. Eliza joined him with her shawl over her head. "Well." He pointed, "That part is wrong." She waited. He did not explain it away. He did not blame the angle of the wind. "I placed it wrong," he said. "Needs moving farther west." Eliza looked at the small drift, then at him. "You admit mistakes easily." "No, I hate them," he gave a tired half-smile, "but hiding them makes them expensive." The word stayed with her all day. They moved the failed section before noon. Annie helped carry small willow pieces, her cheeks red from the cold. When she reached the barn door, she pulled on the handle and opened it easily. Only then did Eliza notice the latch had been lowered. Not much, just enough for Annie to reach without standing on tiptoe. She looked at Silas across the yard. He was tightening a post, pretending not to see her notice. That quiet little repair broke something open in Eliza more than the windmill had. A windmill saved labor, a trench saved stone, a cellar saved food, but that lowered latch had been made for no reason except kindness. After supper, Annie fell asleep at the kitchen table while sorting dried beans, her head heavy beside the bowl. Silas had gone out to check Juniper. Without thinking, Eliza lifted the girl into her arms. Annie curled against her, warm and trusting. Eliza froze. For one strange second, the kitchen disappeared. There was only the weight of a child against her heart and the terrible sweetness of being needed. She carried Annie to bed and laid her beneath the quilt. But when she should have stepped away, she remained there, smoothing one dark strand of hair from the girl's cheek. Annie stirred Miss Eliza. "Yes. When Papa fixes enough things, do we still have to leave?" Eliza's hand went still. Outside, Silas's boots sounded softly on the porch. Eliza looked toward the doorway, knowing he might have heard. The question hung in the little room like a lantern no one dared touch. And for the first time since the stranger had come through her gate, Eliza was afraid not that he would stay, but that he would go. Silas had heard Annie's question. Eliza knew it before she turned around. He stood in the doorway of the little room with his hat in one hand and cold air still clinging to his coat. His eyes moved from Annie's sleepy face to Eliza's hand resting near the child's hair. He did not speak right away, and that silence carried more tenderness than any answer could have held. Annie blinked up at him, half awake and half dreaming. "Papa. I'm here. Do we?" Silas stepped closer and sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at Eliza once, not asking her to answer, not placing the weight of his child's hope in her hands. "We go where I can keep you safe," he said softly. Annie's eyes grew heavier. "Isn't this safe?" The question was so simple that it seemed to stop the house from breathing. The stove popped in the kitchen. Wind pressed softly against the windows. Somewhere outside, Juniper shifted in the barn and the new latch held firm against the cold. Silas brushed a strand of hair from Annie's forehead. "Sleep now." "That is not yes," she whispered. "No," he said, voice low, "it is not." Annie frowned faintly, but sleep pulled her under before she could argue. Silas remained beside her until her breathing settled. Eliza stood near the quilt, feeling as though she had been caught holding something precious that did not belong to her. When they returned to the kitchen, neither of them sat. Silas placed his hat on the table, then picked it up again, restless in a way Eliza had not seen since Annie's cough. "I should have spoken to her before this," he said. She asked what children ask when adults leave the truth lying around. He looked toward the small room. "I never meant to let her hope too much." Eliza folded her arms, though the gesture felt weaker than usual. Hope is not a horse you can keep tied outside until you need it. Silas turned back to her. For a moment something nearly passed between them. Not a confession, not yet, something more fragile like a match struck in wind. Then he looked down. "I wrote to Fort Kearney last week," he said. "There is a mill there. The owner promised winter work before the wagon broke." Eliza had known he was trying to reach work. She had known from the first night that he had a destination beyond her gate. Still, hearing the name of another place felt like a board pulled loose from beneath her feet. "When did he answer?" "This morning. Elmer brought the letter with the axle bolts." Eliza's face stayed still only because she forced it to. "And if I reach him within 10 days, the position is mine. Pump work, mill repairs, room behind the shop, steady wages through winter." "That sounds like what you needed." "Yes." The word fell heavily. Eliza moved to the stove and lifted the kettle, though no one had asked for coffee. "Then you should go." Silas watched her back. "Is that what you want?" She hated him a little for asking so gently. "It is not my place to want." "It may be." "No," she set the kettle down too hard. "This is my farm, Silas, not a promise." "I know that." "Do you? Because Annie is placing cups on my table. You are lowering latches and moving snow fences and fixing every broken thing that has stared at me for years. and now you ask me what I want as if wanting has ever kept anything from leaving." The words came out sharper than she meant. Once loose, they could not be gathered back. Selah stood very still. Eliza looked toward the dark window, ashamed of how much truth had escaped her. "My husband wanted a larger life," she said. "He took the wheat money and 2 horses to find it, left me a note like I was a chore he had decided not to finish." Selah's face softened, but he did not step closer. "He never came back?" he asked. "No." "Did you want him to?" The question should have offended her. Instead, it reached some old, honest place she had not opened in years. "At first," she said. "Then I wanted him to come back only so I could stop waiting. After that, I wanted nothing from him except the years he took with his leaving." Silas lowered his eyes. Eliza pressed a hand against the table. "So yes, Fort Kearny sounds like what you needed. And no, I will not stand here and ask a man to stay where he did not choose to." Silas nodded slowly. "I would never ask you to do that." "I know." That was the trouble, she did know. If he had been selfish, she could have hated him. If he had taken too much, she could have locked every door again and called herself wise. But Selah's boon had come through her gate asking for one night and had spent every day since proving he knew how to stand near another person's life without trying to own it. He looked toward Annie's room. "I have to see if the job is what they promised. I owe her that chance." Eliza swallowed, "Then take it." Silas picked up his hat, but his hand lingered on the brim. "We will leave after first light if Juniper holds." The kitchen grew very quiet. Eliza nodded once. That was all she trusted herself to give. The next morning arrived clear and bitter cold. Frost lay thick on the wagon seat. Juniper's breath rose in white clouds as Silas checked the harness. The repaired axle sat straight and strong. Eliza had packed dried apples, cornbread, and a small cloth bundle of salt pork without calling it a gift. Annie moved through the kitchen slowly. She opened the drawer beside the stove and took out her mother's tin cup. For a moment, she held it close to her chest the old way. Then she looked at Eliza. "Should I leave it here?" she asked. Eliza's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "The important things should stay with the people they belong to." Annie nodded, but her eyes filled. She slipped the cup into her coat pocket. Then she looked at the little step stool by the basin. "I cannot take that." "No," Eliza said, "it belongs to the house." Annie touched the stool once gently, as if saying goodbye to a friend. Outside, Silas finished tying the last bundle to the wagon. Eliza came onto the porch with his gloves in her hands. "The seam was splitting," she said. "I mended it." He looked at the gloves, then at her. "Thank you." "It is only stitching." "No," he said quietly, "it is not." For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Eliza held out the barn key. Silas looked at it. "You forgot this." He took it slowly, then tried to return it. "You should keep it." Eliza closed his fingers around the key before she lost the courage. "In case you come back before I hear the gate." The words hung between them, plain and trembling. Silas's eyes changed. It was not a smile. It was not relief. It was the look of a man who had been given a road back and understood the cost of it. "I will keep it safe," he said. Eliza wanted to say more. She wanted to tell Annie to leave the cup in the drawer because a part of her believed objects could hold people in place. She wanted to ask Silas what would happen if Fort Kearny was everything he hoped. She wanted to ask whether he had ever felt the house growing less empty when he stepped through the door at night. Instead, she said, "Travel before the sun softens the road." Silas climbed onto the wagon. Annie sat beside him with the blanket tucked around her knees. Juniper stepped forward at his quiet command. At the gate, Annie turned back. "Will the barn cat forget me?" Eliza looked down at the gray cat sitting beneath the porch, pretending he had no interest in anyone. "He forgets nothing that concerns food." Annie smiled through tears. Then the wagon rolled beyond the gate. The repaired hinge did not squeal. Silas had fixed it days earlier with oil and a small wooden shim, saying only that a gate should not tell the whole farm every time a person left. Now it let them go in silence. Eliza stood on the porch long after the wagon disappeared beyond the low rise. The wind moved across the field and through the willow fence. Snow lay in small white ridges exactly where Silas had taught it to rest. Inside, the farmhouse waited. She entered and found 3 cups on the kitchen table. Annie had set them there before dawn. Eliza took one away, then another. She stood holding the 3rd cup for a long time before placing it back on the table. Let me know in the comments what you would have done if you were Eliza. Would you have asked him to stay, or would you have let him choose freely, even if it broke your heart? For 6 days the farm returned to its old rhythm, but the rhythm no longer fit. Eliza milked Buttercup and Maud. She checked the windmill. She opened the cellar vents each morning and closed them halfway each evening. She inspected the apples every Monday, just as Silas had carved on the wooden tag. She fed the barn cat beneath the porch because Annie had always remembered to do it. On the 3rd morning, she set 3 cups on the table again by mistake. On the 4th, she did it on purpose. By the 7th day, the sky began to change. The cattle turned their backs north. The air grew strangely still. A pale ring circled the moon after sunset. The dried apple strings under the porch roof twisted, though there was almost no wind. Eliza knew prairie weather. Something hard was coming. That night she checked the barn twice and carried extra wood inside. She stood at the kitchen window, looking toward the road Silas had taken. There was nothing there but darkness, frozen grass, and the silent gate. Near midnight the first gust struck. It slammed snow against the north wall and made the windows shiver. Eliza reached for the lamp. Then the farm dog barked once. Not at the storm. At the gate. Eliza stepped onto the porch with the lantern held high. Snow blew sideways through the light. At first, she saw only the fence posts and the white blur of the road. Then 2 figures appeared beyond the gate. A man holding a lead rope. A child beside him with a tin cup clutched in one hand. Silas Boone stood in the storm with snow on his shoulders and the barn key hanging from a string around his neck. Before he could speak, Eliza opened the gate herself. Eliza did not ask why they had come back until Silas and Annie were inside. The storm was already moving hard across the yard, carrying fine snow that stung the skin like thrown sand. Juniper stood trembling near the gate, her coat white along the back, her ears pinned against the wind. Silas led the mare toward the barn, but Eliza took the lantern and walked with him. No words passed between them while they worked. That was the way of true danger on the frontier. It did not leave room for speeches. It asked only whether your hands knew what to do. Silas settled Juniper in the warmest stall. Eliza checked the cows. The cattle shifted uneasily, but the reinforced north wall held firm. No hard whistle of wind cut through the boards. No frozen draft pressed the animals into one frightened corner. When they came back into the kitchen, Annie stood by the stove with her wet mittens in her hands. Snow melted in her hair. Her tin cup rested on the table beside 3 cups Eliza had never put away. The sight of it made Eliza's throat tighten. Silas removed his hat. His face was worn from travel and cold, but his eyes were clear. "I went to Fort Kearney," he said. Eliza stood still. The work was there, just as promised: steady wages, a room behind the mill, repair jobs lined up through winter. Annie looked down at the floor. Silas's voice grew quieter, but the room was for one man, not a man and a child. Eliza's hand closed around the back of a chair. "They told me a family in town could keep Annie until spring," he continued. "Good people maybe, kind enough maybe, but strangers." Annie slipped one hand into her pocket, then remembered the tin cup was already on the table. Her fingers closed on empty cloth. Silas looked at his daughter, then back at Eliza. I spent one night there trying to call it wisdom. By morning, I knew it was cowardice dressed up as a plan. I will not build a life by leaving the only family I have left outside of it. The stove crackled. Outside, the wind struck the house with a deep, heavy shove. The lantern flame bent, then steadied. Eliza wanted to speak, but no words came cleanly. She had imagined many reasons he might return: a failed job, a broken wagon, a road closed by weather. She had not imagined this reason, plain and painful and full of a father's love. Annie lifted her eyes. May I put my cup back in the drawer? Eliza breathed in slowly. Yes, she said, and wash your hands after. Supper will be ready soon. Annie's face changed first with relief, then with something brighter than relief. She carried the tin cup to the drawer beside the stove, opened it carefully, and placed it inside as if returning a small heart to its proper place. Silas watched her. Eliza watched him. No one spoke of staying, not yet. The storm did not allow it. By dawn, the blizzard had taken the prairie. The world beyond the windows vanished behind white wind. Fence posts disappeared. The road became nothing. Snow struck the house sideways, never falling so much as charging. The cold deepened until every metal latch burned the hand that touched it. Eliza knew storms. She had survived them alone, but this one had a weight inside it that made the house feel small beneath the sky. They moved by duty. Silas checked the barn before breakfast, rope tied around his waist and the other end fastened inside the porch door. Eliza held the rope with both hands until he crossed the yard. More than once, the wind shoved him sideways. He reached the barn only because the snow fence had done its work. The great drift lay far north of the door, caught along the willow line like a white wall built in the field. The barn entrance stood clear enough to open. When he came back, his beard was stiff with frost. The fence is holding, he said. Eliza nodded, but there was no time to praise it. Annie kept a slate near the kitchen door and marked every chore as it was finished. Cows fed, water checked, stove wood counted, cellar vents narrowed, chickens secured, Juniper's leg rubbed warm. Each line was small, but together they held back fear. Late that morning, the windmill slowed. Eliza heard the change before Silas spoke. The steady rhythm of the pump weakened, caught, then stopped. He looked toward the window. No, Eliza said. If it freezes solid, we lose water. Not without rope. I know. She took the coil from the pantry hook herself. Her fingers moved fast but carefully as she tied it around his waist. Silas watched her hands. I have climbed in worse. I have heard men say foolish things before doing foolish things. Despite the danger, his mouth almost curved. Eliza pulled the knot tight. Come back with the rope still around you. I intend to. Intentions are not enough. His eyes met hers. Then I will do the work carefully. She let him go only because the animals needed water, and because she trusted him not to mistake bravery for carelessness. Outside, Silas crossed the yard in a blur of snow. He climbed the tower slowly, one rung at a time. The wind clawed at his coat. Ice had locked the linkage near the upper joint. He struck it gently first, then harder, never wild, never hurried. Eliza held the rope from below, boots braced against the frozen ground. Snow filled her eyelashes. Her hands ached. She did not loosen her grip. One careful blow. Then another. The ice cracked. The wheel shuddered, turned halfway, stopped, then turned again. Beneath the tower, the pump answered with a rough groan. Water burst into the trough, dark at first, then clear. Silas climbed down, and only when both his boots touched ground did Eliza realize she had been holding her breath. You are shaking, he said. So are you. That may be the cold. That may be sense finally arriving. For one brief moment, they almost laughed. Then pounding sounded from the gate. Not the wind, a fist, hard, desperate, human. Silas and Eliza looked at each other, then ran. At the gate stood Martin Vale with two exhausted cattle and a face half covered in ice. His fine coat was torn at one sleeve. Snow clung to his eyebrows and beard. The pride had gone out of him, leaving only a man beaten down by weather. "My north barn door is buried," he gasped. "Had to break boards loose to get these two out. I have more cattle trapped if the drift shifts." Eliza did not remind him of the basket fence. She did not mention his laughter. She opened the side gate. "Bring them in." Together they pulled the frightened animals toward the barn. Silas took one rope. Martin took the other. Eliza pushed against the wind beside them until her shoulder burned. The barn door opened cleanly, just as the snow fence had promised it would. Inside, Martin stood staring at the warm shelter, the reinforced wall, the clear path. The animals spread safely across dry bedding. He looked toward the north field, where the great drift sat far from the barn. His voice came low. "I put my snow in the wrong place." Silas brushed frost from his sleeve. "Most men do once." Martin glanced at him, expecting insult. There was none. Before sunset, more pounding came. This time it was Prudence Whitcomb with 3 travelers whose sleigh had gone off the road. Her face was pale with cold and fear, and her questions had frozen before they reached her tongue. Eliza brought them in. The farmhouse filled with wet wool, shaking hands, and grateful silence. The cellar gave up potatoes. The pantry gave beans. The dried apples Annie had helped string became food for strangers. Nothing had spoiled. Nothing had frozen. Prudence watched Annie carry a bowl to one of the travelers, then take the smaller portion for herself without complaint. Eliza saw it too. When Annie turned away, Eliza quietly switched the bowls. Prudence saw that as well. By the 3rd day, the storm still raged, but the house had become something larger than shelter. Martin cleared snow from the side path. Prudence portioned food without asking who deserved more. Silas kept the windmill breathing. Eliza held the ledger and the household together. Annie marked each finished chore on her slate with solemn care. Near evening, the wind finally began to weaken. Everyone stood still for a moment, listening. The roar softened. The walls held. The barn held. The cellar held. The windmill turned. And in the kitchen drawer, Annie's tin cup rested beside Eliza's spoons, no longer hidden, no longer carried like a fear. Eliza looked across the crowded room at Silas. He was kneeling by the stove, adding wood, his face tired and his hands cracked from cold. He looked nothing like a hero from a dime novel. He looked like a man who stayed. And that, Eliza realized, was the bravest thing she had ever seen. When the blizzard finally loosened its grip, the silence it left behind felt almost unreal. For 3 days, the prairie had roared like a living thing. It had clawed at doors, buried fences, blinded men, and tested every nail, board, hinge, wall, and heart on Sparrow Bend Farm. Then, sometime before dawn on the 4th morning, the wind fell away. Eliza woke to quiet. Not the old quiet. Not the empty quiet that had filled the house for 9 years. This quiet held breathing. It held the soft scrape of Prudence folding blankets in the front room. It held Martin Vale coughing near the stove, too proud to sleep but too worn out to stand. It held Annie curled beneath a quilt by the kitchen wall, one hand resting near the drawer where her mother's tin cup waited. It held Silas sitting in a chair by the door, head bowed, boots still on, finally asleep after fighting the storm longer than any man should have. Eliza stood in the middle of the kitchen and listened. The house was full, and nothing inside her wanted it empty again. Morning light came slowly, pale and silver through frost-edged windows. Outside, the world had changed shape. The yard lay open in narrow paths where they had kept walking. Beyond the barn, the snow fence had caught a great white drift nearly as tall as a horse. Farther away, the road had vanished beneath smooth snow. Fence posts wore white caps. The windmill stood black against the bright sky, its wheel turning slowly, still alive. The farm had survived. Not untouched, No farm survived winter untouched, but standing, breathing, ready for another day. Silas woke when Eliza opened the stove door. He sat forward quickly, then blinked as he remembered where he was. How long was I out? Long enough to prove you are human. He rubbed one hand over his face. That bad? You were snoring like the sawmill in Red Willow. Across the room, Annie opened one eye. He always does that when he is tired. Silas looked wounded. I do not. Prudence, without turning from the blankets, said, You do. Even Martin gave a rough little laugh, then winced as if laughter cost him pride. That small sound changed the room. It did not erase the storm. It did not mend every fence beyond the window, but it broke the hard crust that fear had left behind. By noon, people began taking stock. Elias Pike arrived with 2 men from town, pushing through snow with shovels and a mule team. He stopped at the barn door, looked at the clear entrance, then at the huge drift far out in the field. He muttered, that willow basket did its work. Martin stood beside the fence, hands in his coat pockets. His face tightened, but not with anger this time, with the discomfort of a man meeting the truth in daylight. It did, he said. Everyone heard him. Silas said nothing. That seemed to shame Martin more than any sharp answer would have. They spent the next 2 days helping those who had not fared as well. Martin's ranch had lost part of its north barn wall and several cattle had to be moved before the next freeze. Prudence's church cellar had taken water after a drift melted against the back steps. A young family east of town had lost their chicken shed roof. Elias' men carried boards. Martin brought wire. Silas repaired pump handles and broken hinges until his knuckles split. Eliza cooked, counted, sorted, and sent food where it was needed, though she marked every jar in the ledger out of habit. Annie helped too. She carried kindling, folded cloths, and handed out dried apples with great seriousness. When one traveler thanked her and called her a brave little thing, Annie looked toward Eliza before answering. I was only doing my share. Eliza's heart warmed at that. Doing her share. The words sounded small, they were not. They meant Annie no longer saw herself as a burden being carried from place to place. She had become part of the work, part of the house, part of the life growing under that roof. On the 3rd evening after the storm, Prudence came to the kitchen while Eliza was washing jars. For once she brought no basket, no syrup, no warnings, only a tired face and hands red from cold water. I owe you an apology, Prudence said. Eliza kept her hands in the basin. For which part? Prudence accepted the blow with a nod. For speaking fear over your table and calling it concern. Eliza looked at her then. Prudence glanced toward the small room where Annie slept. I saw how that child looked when I questioned her father. I told myself I was protecting you, but I was protecting the town from gossip it had not earned the right to speak. The words were not easy for her, that made them worth more. Eliza dried her hands. You were afraid for me. Yes. So was I. Prudence's eyes softened. Eliza looked toward the stove where the fire burned steady and warm. Fear is useful when it wakes you up. It becomes dangerous when it starts choosing for you. Prudence nodded slowly. You learned that before I did. No, Eliza said, I am still learning. Later that night, Martin came to the porch while Silas was stacking split wood under the eaves. Eliza stood near the door, close enough to hear, though neither man seemed surprised by it. Martin held out a folded paper. Silas did not take it. What is that? A bill of sale draft I had drawn for Eliza's west field last spring. Eliza stiffened. Martin looked at her directly. I kept it because I thought winter would make the choice for you. No one spoke. The lantern beside the door swung gently in the cold air. Martin lowered his eyes. That was not neighborly, that was waiting. He tore the paper once, then again, the pieces fell into his gloved hand. I will not ask for the field again. Eliza studied him carefully. Why say it now? Because a man should admit when he has been standing at the wrong gate. Silas leaned a split log against the stack. Most men do once. This time Martin heard the grace in the words. He nodded, then looked toward the barn. I brought fencing wire. I will help mend the west pasture tomorrow. You do not owe me labor, Eliza said. No, Martin glanced at the torn paper in his hand. I owe myself better conduct. That was the closest thing to justice Eliza had wanted from him. Not ruin, not shame, just truth standing in the open where polite words could no longer hide it. The next morning, the whole farm seemed brighter. Sun flashed on the snow. The windmill turned. Water poured clean into the trough. The barn doors opened without digging. The cellar smelled of apples, earth, and cool air, not rot. Near the door, Silas's small wooden tag still hung with its carved reminder. Check apples every Monday. Eliza touched the tag with one finger. So many things had been saved by being noticed while still small. A tender cow, a bent rod, a damp wall, a child's fear, a widow's loneliness, a man's guilt, a heart that had not died only locked itself behind too many doors. That evening, after Martin and Elias had gone, and Prudence had taken the last travelers into town, Sparrow Bend Farm belonged to its own quiet again. But this time, 3 cups sat on the kitchen table because 3 people lived there. Annie stood on her step stool at the basin, washing her hands with great care. The barn cat waited beneath the chair for crumbs. Silas came in from the barn carrying the key Eliza had let him keep through the storm. He placed it on the table. Eliza looked up from the ledger. I should not assume I still have the right to this, he said. Annie went very still at the basin. Eliza looked at the key, then at Silas. His face held no demand, no pressure, no wounded pride. He was giving the choice back to her because that was who he was. A man who could enter a broken place, repair what he could, love what he was allowed to love, and still leave the door in someone else's hands. Eliza closed the ledger. For years, she had believed love meant losing the right to decide. She had believed trust meant handing someone a knife and waiting for the cut. She had believed that if she carried every key herself, nothing could be taken. But Grant had taken what he wanted without a key. And Silas had held a key for weeks without taking anything that was not offered. Eliza rose from the table. She picked up her heavy ring of keys from the nail near the stove. One by one she touched them: pantry, smokehouse, cellar, tool house, barn. Then she unclipped a smaller key from the ring. Silas watched, hardly breathing. Eliza crossed to the wall beside the kitchen door. For 9 years, one nail had held every key she was willing to show the world. She took a hammer from the shelf, set a new nail beside the old one, and drove it into the wood with 3 firm strikes. The sound seemed to move through the whole house. Then she hung the smaller key on the new nail. Silas looked at it. The house key, Eliza said. Annie turned from the basin, water dripping from her fingers. Eliza's voice stayed steady, though her heart did not. Do not lose it. Silas removed his hat slowly. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak. Then he walked to the wall and hung his hat on the empty hook beside the door. I won't, he said. It was not a grand promise. It was not poetry, it was better. It was simple enough to live by. Annie crossed the kitchen, opened the drawer beside the stove, and took out her mother's tin cup. Eliza thought she meant to hold it. Instead, Annie placed it on the table beside the other cups. For supper, she said. Silas bowed his head. Eliza reached out and smoothed the girl's hair, no longer stopping herself before the tenderness showed. Outside, the north wind moved softly through the willow fence, laying snow where it belonged. The repaired windmill turned in the fading light. The barn stood warm. The cellar breathed. The gate waited silent on its oiled hinge. And inside Sparrow Bend Farm, a widow who had once mistaken silence for safety finally understood what home was. It was not a locked door. It was not land held alone. It was not a heart kept safe by never opening. Home was a child's cup in a kitchen drawer, a man's hat on the hook by the door, 3 cups on the table when winter pressed against the glass. It was work shared, grief spoken gently, fear answered with patience, and love trusted slowly enough to become strong. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more emotional Wild West stories where broken lives find healing on the frontier. Eliza Wren did not lose her farm that winter. She did not lose herself either. And when Christmas morning came bright over the Nebraska prairie, Silas Boone stood beside her on the porch, Annie between them with the barn cat winding around her boots and the whole farm shining under clean snow. Eliza looked toward the gate where he had once stood begging for one night. Then she looked at the man who had stayed without ever trying to own what he saved. For the first time in 9 years, she did not fear the sound of a door opening. Because this time, the people who entered had come home,